2015 is going to be an important year for international development cooperation as the world decides on the new international framework to replace the Millennium Development Goals. It's therefore a good moment to look at the changing development panorama. And what we see when we look at this is that emerging powers are playing an increasingly important role and will continue to play an ever-growing role in international development. We know that emerging powers are very important investors, trade partners, political partners and donors to developing countries, and this is only going to become more so. In a recently published book by FRIDE, we look at 5 emerging powers and how they engage on development issues and what opportunity there is for the EU to work with them. What we see when we look across this 5 is that they have similar interests for their increased role in international development. These are, for example, foreign policy interests in terms of being seen as a global power, in terms of having multilateral leverage, of being a regional power and improving bilateral relations. There's certainly economic interests in terms of improving trade relations and expanding markets. And for some of these emerging powers, they are security interests. Their engagement in international development allows them to promote their own security, their regional security dominance, and in some cases energy security. But while we see that they have similar broad interests for their engagement in international development, we also see that they have very different ways of doing this, and this offers different implications for the EU in terms of the opportunity and the space to engage with these powers. We analysed the development agenda of 5 emerging powers: China, India, Brazil, South Africa and Korea. And what we saw is that they have quite different ways of doing development. China, for example, is very focused on using development assistance to build bilateral relationships around the world, mostly to further its economic interests, but also within its own region to further political and security interests. India likewise focuses strongly on using development for bilateral relationships, but primarily in its own region where most of its aid is spent. It uses this both to further economic interests, but also to further regional rivalries with China. On the other hand, we see that Brazil and South Africa take a much more multilateral approach to development. Both are keen to be seen as serious multilateral players, and Brazil in fact channels a large amount of its aid through multilateral institutions, particularly the UN. South Africa is more focused naturally on African multilateral institutions, particularly those involved with peace and security, which are obviously critical to its own national interests. And finally, what we see is that Korea is a bit of an outlier among these 5. Korea has recently joined the OECD DAC, which is a group of traditional, mostly Western donors, and is hence aligning more with the approach of traditional donors. The European Union is the world's biggest donor, and it's going to continue to be a very important power in terms of international development. But it's important that the EU does also seek to understand and engage more with the emerging powers, given their growing influence in terms of development. Certainly the EU is seeking to do this, there's no question. It's trying to use, for example, its strategic partnership frameworks to engage with, to dialogue with, and perhaps even to collaborate with these powers on development. But what we see is the different ways that these powers approach development really provides different levels of space and different types of opportunities for the EU to work with them in this field. For example, on one extreme we have India. India is not keen to engage with any Western donors, to distance itself from them, and maintains a very strong South-South rhetoric, which would make it difficult, almost impossible for the EU to work with them on development. China takes a similar approach, although slightly less extreme. China certainly doesn't want to be seen to be too closely involved with Western donors and isn't keen to partner with the EU. Then we look at Brazil. Brazil has some reluctance to be too involved with Western donors, but certainly on key issues where there are shared interests, such as food security, there is some openness to partnership. Then we look at South Africa. South Africa and the EU, while so far there has been no real collaboration on development at international level, there does appear to be opportunities for this. South Africa and the EU share a number of core interests in terms of development related to African peace and security, poverty reduction and so on, where there could be openings for greater collaboration. And finally, Korea. Korea is very keen to partner with Western donors, to learn from Western donors, and likewise to share its own development experience with Western donors. And certainly there are real opportunities that can be taken forward by the EU and Korea to work together.